The rain hammered relentlessly on the muddy banks of the Loing, a cold, merciless downpour that turned the world into a gray, lifeless expanse. The river, swollen and angry, churned with a vengeance, carrying away branches, debris, perhaps even secrets. "Will you really not take shelter?" The captain of the gendarmes tried once again, his voice laced with exasperation. Maigret did not move. He stood there like a statue, his broad shoulders hunched beneath his soaked overcoat, hands buried deep in his pockets. His bowler hat, now a basin of rainwater, dripped with every slight movement, yet he refused to shake it off. A single word, gruff and barely audible, escaped the clenched teeth that held his ever-present pipe. "Number." It was always like this. The cases that twisted and turned, the ones that led to uneasy truths, were never those he chose to pursue. They were the ones that fell into his lap by chancer, as in this case, through an inconvenient lack of will to refuse. He had arrived in Nemours the previous evening for a trivial matter, a mere formality with Captain Pillamant of the gendarmerie. The captain, a pleasant and cultured man, had been the perfect host, offering Maigret a fine dinner, good wine, and a guest room for the night. And then, as if fate had been waiting for the moment, the telephone had rung. At 6 in the morning, with the sky still black as ink, the captain's soft voice broke the lingering warmth of sleep. "Superintendent, are you awake?" "I am now. There's been a peculiar accident, a few kilometers from here. Will you come?" Of course, Maigret had gone, and now he stood in the relentless rain, watching a scene as bleak as the weather itself. The highway ran along the riverbank, stretching between Nemours and Montargis, its usual emptiness disturbed by the flashing lights of gendarme cars and the low murmur of restless voices. The river, a thick, dirty brown, carried more than just rainwater in its current. A cluster of poplars lined the distant canal, their skeletal forms swaying under the burden of the storm. No village, no real sign of civilization, only an inn, 700 meters away. The Auberge des Pêcheurs. Locally, it had a more sinister name, l'Auberge aux Noyés, the drowned men's inn. And now, true to its reputation, it had seemingly claimed another victim. Or two. No one was certain yet. The crane creaked as it struggled against the river's grip, while a diver had already gone down, his air hose snaking through the water's surface. Two men in oilskins worked the pump, their faces grim and set. Ambulances stood idle in the downpour, their purpose already nullified. The bodies, if there were any, had not yet surfaced. A 10-ton lorry, its hulking frame looming just before a bend in the road, stood as the only real witness to the night's events. Joseph Lecoyne, its driver, had been the one to report the accident. The details were scarce, and that made Maigret uneasy. The previous night, shortly after 8 o'clock, the lorry had been navigating the highway when it came upon a stationary Carnot lights. No movement. Too late to swerve. The impact had sent the car tumbling off the road, plunging straight into the river. Lecoyne swore he heard voices, muffled cries that barely cut through the storm. Down by the canal, the skipper of a barge, Beltherese, had heard something too. But by the time they reached the riverbank with a lantern, all that remained was the echo of rushing water. Still, something didn't sit right. "Unless the bodies are stuck in the car, they'll never be found," muttered the innkeeper, a stout man sheltered under an oversized umbrella. "They'll drift all the way to the Seine, maybe beyond unless the roots catch them." "They're not in the car," the lorry driver objected. It was an open top. The innkeeper turned to him sharply. "That's strange." "Why?" "Because just yesterday, a young couple in an open car stopped by. They had lunch here, said they'd be back for the night, but they never returned." Maigret, though outwardly impassive, absorbed the words like a sponge. He had learned long ago that crime often whispered before it screamed. The diver surfaced, pulling off his mask, his expression unreadable. The others moved in quickly, eager for news. The crane whined. The river resisted. And then, at last, the car began to rise. And with it, the truth. The crane roared to life, its metallic groan cutting through the steady drumming of rain on the river's surface. Motorists, delayed on the road by the commotion, honked impatiently, their curiosity getting the better of them as heads leaned out of car windows, eyes squinting through the downpour. The river, reluctant to surrender its secrets, fought against the machine. But inch by inch, the wreckage began to rise. From the murky depths emerged the upper part of a gray automobile, its slick metal body dripping with river sludge, its windshield shattered, its frame twisted from the violent plunge. The wheels came last, coated in debris, thick with mud. The air smelled of damp earth, engine oil, and something more unsettling that only a few had begun to notice. Maigret's shoes were soaked through, his trousers stained with mud that had splattered up as the car was dragged onto the embankment. He longed for a hot cup of coffee, something to drive the cold from his bones, but he refused to step away from the scene. The captain of the gendarmerie, sensing the inspector's mood, did not press him to seek shelter. No one did. "Careful, boys. Keep it clear on the left," a gendarme barked. The wrecked vehicle stood on the bank now, a tragic shell of what it had once been. Its front end was crushed, confirming what the lorry driver had already described. The impact had sent it careening off the road, but that wasn't what intrigued Maigret. No. What gnawed at him was the way it sat there twisted, empty, as if it had secrets buried deeper than the river itself. A lieutenant leaned into the car, wiping rainwater from his brow as he jotted down the registration number. Meanwhile, the captain, sifting through the dashboard, found what he was looking for: a small metal plate, partially rusted but still legible. "R. Dubois," he read aloud, 135 Avenue des Ternes, Paris. "I'll contact Paris," the captain offered, looking to Maigret for approval. Maigret barely acknowledged him. This wasn't his cassonade yet. This was a job for the gendarmerie, a routine accident, a bureaucratic process. And yet, something about it unsettled him, made him linger in the rain instead of retreating to the inn for warmth. The wreck attracted more than just the authorities. By now, onlookers curious, nosy, oblivious to the grim nature of the scene had gathered. Drivers from passing cars had stopped, stepping onto the slick road to get a better look. Some reached out, fingers brushing against the damp, dented frame, as if touching the wreck might make the story behind it clearer. It was one of these bystanders, a man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, who casually twisted the handle of the luggage compartment. The trunk popped open without resistance. And then, a gasp, a strangled cry. The cigarette fell from the man's lips, hissing as it landed in a puddle. The crowd surged forward. People murmured, whispered, jostled to see what had made the man stumble backward, his face pale with shock. Maigret moved swiftly, his presence commanding enough to part the onlookers. He didn't have to ask what they'd found. He could already see it. "Back, everyone back." His voice, rough and unmistakable, cut through the noise. "Don't touch anything." There, crammed into the tight space of the luggage compartment, was a body. The position was unnatural. Grotesque knees bent up to the chest, arms twisted at odd angles, as though whoever had placed the victim there had struggled to make them fit. But what caught Maigret's eye first, before anything else, was the hair. A mass of platinum blonde curls, matted and wet, spilling over the edge of the trunk. "Captain," Maigret said darkly, "clear the area, now." The innkeeper, Justin Rosier, was among the onlookers, his massive umbrella barely shielding him from the downpour. He took a step forward, his voice low but laced with significance. "I recognize that car," he murmured. "It belonged to my young couple." Maigret turned to him, eyes narrowing. "What couple?" "They came to the inn yesterday, had lunch, said they'd be back last night, but they never showed." "Names?" Rosier nodded. "They filled out a form. I have it back at the inn." Another voice interrupted this time, the doctor who had been standing among the crowd, observing. He knelt beside the body, his fingers barely grazing the pale skin before he exhaled sharply. "She's been dead at least 3 days." Maigret felt the first stirrings of something more than suspicion. 3 days, longer than the crash. Someone pulled at his sleeve. "Superintendent," the doctor said, voice tense, "you realize this woman has been murdered." The word cut through the noise like a blade. With what? Maigret asked. A razor, the doctor answered grimly. Her throat's been cut. The rain did not let up. It poured mercilessly, dripping from the broken car, soaking the lifeless body, running in rivulets through the deep grooves in the muddy road. And in the shifting, faceless crowd, Maigret could already feel it, the quiet stir of a case that had just become something far worse than an accident. The rain had settled into a relentless rhythm, drumming against the roof of the inn and blurring the edges of the road outside. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke and the quiet hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of activity from the gendarmes and the journalists who had descended like vultures. Maigret sat near the window, his pipe between his teeth, eyes narrowed in thought as he watched the chaos unfold. The investigation had taken a strange turn. The carrots battered, mud-covered, remains now standing like a ruin on the riverbank no longer belonged to Monsieur Dubois. The information had come swiftly, almost too conveniently. Dubois had sold it a week prior to a garage owner at the Port Maillot. That garage owner, in turn, had sold it just 3 days ago, in a cash transaction that left no paper trail. A young man had driven it off the lot, nameless and untraceable. Maigret's fingers tapped idly against the wooden table as the implications settled. 3 days ago, the same amount of time the doctor had estimated the woman's body had been in the trunk. Coincidence? Hardly. I've got the name. The words cut through the din, spoken with a mixture of urgency and impatience. It was the innkeeper, Justin Rogier, clearly frustrated at being overlooked. He puffed out his chest, eager to be the center of attention. "Just come up to my place," he insisted. But before Maigret could respond, another interruption arrived in the form of a red-haired journalist, his eyes gleaming with the hunger of a man who could already see the sensational headlines forming in his mind. He was from the only local paper in Montargis, but more importantly, he was also a correspondent for a major Paris daily. Maigret didn't trust journalists. They had a way of worming their way into an investigation, twisting facts to fit the most dramatic version of events. The redhead tried his luck, lingering on the edges of the scene, eavesdropping, sniffing out any hint of a scoop. Maigret, unimpressed, sent him packing. Captain Pillement did the same, but it hardly mattered. Within minutes, the journalist had locked himself in a telephone booth and was no doubt spinning a story that would be splashed across the papers by morning. An hour later, the damage was done. Reporters swarmed the inn, pressing their credentials against the chests of weary officers, demanding details, spinning speculation into fact. Photographers climbed onto tables, onto chairs, snapping pictures of anything and everything, none of it particularly relevant to the crime. The name of the Auberge aux Noyers would be on every front page. The crime at Drowning Corner. The mystery of the Auberge aux Noyers. The body in the car. The puzzle of the gray car. The sensationalist titles wrote themselves, each more lurid than the last. Maigret remained unaffected. He chewed his sandwich, washed it down with a glass of beer, and continued to observe the unfolding spectacle with the detached patience of a man who had seen this all before. Through it all, only 2 people truly interested him, the skipper of the Belle Thérèse and the driver of the lorry. The skipper, a weathered man with the hunched posture of someone used to fighting against the elements, approached hesitantly. "You know we get a bonus for speed," he said, almost apologetically. "I should have left this morning. So if I might possibly—" "Where are you going to unload?" Maigret asked, his voice unreadable. "Quai des Tournelles, in Paris. Another day on the canal, then nearly a day on the Seine. We'll be there by evening the day after tomorrow." Maigret took another pull from his pipe. "Tell me again what you heard last night." The skipper hesitated, recalling the moment. "We'd just finished supper. My wife had already gone to bed. I was about to do the same when I heard a strange noise outside. You can't always tell what's happening from inside the boat, so I stuck my head through the hatch." "What did you hear?" "A voice," the skipper said, his brow furrowing. "I thought I heard someone calling for help." "In what way?" "It was faint, almost lost in the rain." "A man or a woman?" "More like a man," the skipper admitted. "How long after the first noise?" "Not immediately," the man said, rubbing his chin. I'd been taking off my shoes, and I had time to put my slippers on before I even looked outside. And then? I couldn't step out in slippers, so I went below, grabbed my leather jacket and rubber boots. My wife was still awake, so I told her. He hesitated, as if realizing something for the first time. "What did you tell her?" Maigret pressed. I said, "Maybe something's happened up there." The room seemed to still for a moment. The skipper was a practical man, a man of the river. He had no reason to be dramatic or embellish. If he'd heard something that made him stop before going to bed, something that had lingered in his mind enough to make him speak aloud to his wife, then it was worth considering. Maigret's eyes flickered toward the rain-blurred window. The inn was oddly placed, at a bend in the road that had already claimed more than its share of victims. 3 cars in the last 5 years had plunged into the river at this very spot. The other 2 accidents had been attributed to reckless driving cars speeding too fast around the bend, failing to correct in time. One had taken an entire family of 5 with it. The other had left a single dead driver. And yet, it was hard to ignore the pattern. People already whispered about this place, calling it cursed, a black mark on the road where tragedy seemed to settle like a fog. The Auberge aux Noyes, the drowned men's inn. One look at the reporters, the photographers, the eager hands scribbling notes and dialing telephones, and Maigret knew this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a story. One that would take on a life of its own before the truth could even catch up. And somewhere, in all the noise, in all the distractions, lay the real question. Who had bought that car? And why had they left a dead woman in the trunk? The rain had turned the night into a swirling mass of darkness and sound, the river running high and fast, swallowing anything that came too close. Maigret stood in the small, dimly lit private dining room of the Auberge aux Noyes, the ominously named inn whose walls had no doubt absorbed the whispers of countless secrets. Across from him sat the lorry driver, a hulking man with the rough, weathered face of someone used to long hours on the road. He was still slightly damp from the rain, but he didn't seem particularly shaken. If anything, he looked more inconvenienced than troubled. Out in the main room, reporters hovered like scavengers, trading drinks for stories, twisting details to fit the dramatic headlines they would soon send to their editors. The scene outside had already become something of a spectacle, flashes of cameras illuminating the rain-slicked road, men gesturing wildly as they reimagined the crash in their minds, retelling it in increasingly exaggerated ways. But Maigret wasn't interested in their versions. He wanted facts. He leaned in slightly, his heavy presence filling the small space. "I thought lorry drivers usually traveled in pairs, especially on long hauls." The driver, arms crossed over his massive chest, nodded. "Yeah, we mostly do. My mate hurt his hand last week. He's on sick leave, so I'm on my own." "What time did you leave Paris?" 2 o'clock. "And the roads?" "Slippery as hell. I've got a mixed load, nothing too heavy, but enough that I had to be careful." "You stopped for dinner?" "Of course, we all do. We've got our spots, you know. We meet there more or less at the same time." "Where did you stop?" "Mère Catherine's, just past Nemours. Best food on the route." "How many lorries were parked there?" 4. 2 removal vans from Morin's, a petrol tanker, and an express delivery van. "You ate with the other drivers?" "With 3 of them. The others sat at the next table." Maigret tapped his fingers against the table, his mind assembling a picture. "In what order did you leave?" The driver frowned, thinking back. "Not sure about the others. I left last, had to make a call to Paris first." "To whom?" "My boss. Needed piston rings ready for me at Moulin. Engine wasn't running smooth. 3rd cylinder was acting up." "How much of a head start did the last lorry have on you?" "About 10 minutes. One of the removal vans. I was going faster, though. He must have been 4 or 5 kilometers ahead by the time I got back on the road." Maigret exhaled, letting the silence stretch. Then he said, "And you didn't see the roadster until you hit it?" The driver shook his head, a little too quickly. "Not till it was right in front of me. Too late to avoid the crash." "There were no lights on the car?" "None at all." "You saw nobody?" "Can't say," the man admitted. Rain was coming down hard, my windscreen wipers not great, but after the car hit the water, I thought I saw something. Someone, maybe, moving in the darkness. And then I heard it. Maigret's eyes sharpened. Heard what? A cry, like someone calling for help. He let that settle. Then he said, "In the box under your seat, I noticed an electric torch. Good working order. Why didn't you use it?" The driver hesitated. His thick fingers twitched slightly on the tabletop. "I don't know." He shifted in his chair, his huge frame casting shadows in the low lamplight. "I was panicked. I was afraid my truck might skid into the river too." Maigret let the excuse hang between them. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the inn's windows. Somewhere beyond, the river carried its secrets away, swallowing evidence, erasing footprints. But Maigret had the feeling that this particular secret wasn't going to disappear so easily. The auberge aux Noyers was buzzing with an energy that teetered between morbid fascination and professional chaos. Journalists swarmed like hungry vultures, their press cards flashing, their voices overlapping in an endless pursuit of the next headline. The telephone booth was in constant use, a line of eager reporters waiting impatiently to relay their scoops to Paris. Photographers perched on chairs, snapping shots of the inn's facade, the garage, the road leading to the river, anything that might become iconic when the morning papers rolled out. But in the middle of the frenzy, Maigret remained the calm eye of the storm, his mind working methodically through the layers of this peculiar case. The lorry driver had been dismissed, for now. He had ambled off toward the kitchen, more concerned with securing a hot meal than with the body in the river. His lack of concern gnawed at Maigret. Was it indifference, or something else? The young couple in the gray car. Turning his attention to the innkeeper, Maigret studied the man's face as he recounted the arrival of the couple 2 nights prior. The day before yesterday, in the evening, they arrived in that gray car, the one that was fished out of the river. A young man and a girl. I took them for honeymooners. The innkeeper handed Maigret a registration form. The writing was jagged and uneven, as if written in haste or nervousness. It read, Jean Vertbois, 20 years of age, advertising agent, 18 Rue des Acacias, Paris. Under destination, it simply said, Paris to Nice. For the girl's name, rather than filling out a second form, the young man had lazily scrawled across his own. And Madame. Not a name, just a vague acknowledgement of her presence. That in itself was telling. A very pretty young lady. The innkeeper continued. 17 or 18, I called her the chick privately. She was dressed too lightly for the season, just a thin dress and a sports coat. Luggage, Maigret asked. 1 suitcase. Still up there in their room. A quick search of the suitcase revealed something intriguingly: men's clothes and underwear. Not a single item belonging to the girl. That suggested one of 2 things. She had left home suddenly, unprepared, or she had been picked up along the way. Either way, it added to the mystery of who she was and what had led them to this fateful stop. Did they seem nervous? Maigret pressed. Not at all. If anything, they were thinking only about each other. They spent most of yesterday locked in their bedroom, had their meals sent up. Lily, the barmaid, said it was a bit awkward serving them, considering how little they cared about hiding their feelings. So they weren't in any hurry to get to Nice. I doubt they'd have cared where they stopped, as long as they had a bed. The last time they were seen alive. What about the car? In the garage, until about 4:30 yesterday afternoon, the innkeeper said. By then, it was dark already. I assumed they'd gone for a drive to Montargis or somewhere nearby. We expected them back for dinner. When they didn't return, we waited until 10 before clearing away their table. You never checked the trunk of the car? The landlord made a show of looking offended. I'd never take such a liberty. Maigret, unimpressed, gave a small shrug. He had met enough innkeepers in his time to know how curious they tended to be. If this man hadn't looked inside the trunk, it was likely because he had been afraid of what he might find. And now, the couple was missing. Their car had been pulled from the river. A body had been found, but only one. So where was the girl? And what had really been in that gray car when it left the inn that evening? The Auberge aux Noyers was no longer just an inn, it had become the epicenter of a scandalous, spine-chilling mystery, with journalists turning every corner into an impromptu press office, their voices merging into a chaotic symphony of speculation. Maigret, however, remained untouched by their excitement, sitting quietly in a dim corner of the dining room, methodically assembling the puzzle pieces of this bizarre case that centered around two missing lovers and a corpse that had been traveling in the trunk of their car dead for days before the vehicle ever arrived at the inn. Everything about Jean Vertbois was a contradiction. A young advertising agent, barely 20, suddenly paying in cash for an expensive yet outdated car, carrying a thick wad of 1,000-franc notes, and not even bothering to haggle over the price. More suspiciously, he had spoken about changing the registration plate the very next day, raising the question of whether he was merely indulging in vanity or attempting to cover his tracks. At the time of purchase, he had been alone, yet by Wednesday evening, he arrived at the inn with a girl, barely 17 or 18, wearing clothes far too light for the season, with no luggage of her own, only a single suitcase in their room filled exclusively with men's clothing. The innkeeper had described her as very pretty, the type of girl who looks expensive but not cheap, the kind one would expect to see in high society, which begged the question, had she packed nothing because she had left home in a hurry, or had she even left willingly? On Thursday, the lovers had spent the day in their room, too intoxicated with each other to care about the world beyond their four walls, but by 4:30 p.m., their gray car was seen leaving the garage, and by 8 p.m., it was involved in a crash. The lorry driver had seen nothing until it was two Latino lights on the car, the road slick from rain, then sudden impact. A barge captain near the accident site reported hearing cries for help from the darkness, not just one voice, but at least two, followed by silence. When authorities examined the wreck, the true horror was revealed. The luggage compartment had been forced open, and inside lay the body of a woman, her throat slashed with a razor, dressed immaculately, exuding class and refinement. She had been dead since Monday, the very day Vertbois had purchased the car, her body hastily stuffed into the trunk just hours after her death, traveling undetected through the French countryside for 3 days. Had Jean Vertbois known? Had the girl? And why had they left the inn at all? If they were heading for dinner, why was the car found so far from town? Why were the lights off? Had the car broken down, leaving the inexperienced driver helpless, or had something or someone forced them to stop? And the most chilling question of all, where were they now? The police scoured the area, dragging boats along the riverbed and wading through the shallows, but there was nothing, no footprints on the muddy banks, no bodies in the water, just an empty road, a wrecked car, and a corpse that had been there from the very beginning. The newspapers wasted no time in sensationalizing the mystery, rolling out their first editions with headlines screaming for attention. Teenage lovers carry corpse in car crash into the river. And the muddy waters of the Lowing engulf the guilty couple and their victim. But Maigret wasn't convinced, because the one thing he knew with absolute certainty was that the river had swallowed nothing, not yet. The investigation had entered its most agonizing phase time of uncertainty, contradictions, and false leads. Maigret prowled the inn like a caged animal, his mood growing darker with each passing hour. He hardly spoke, merely grunted in response to questions, sipping his beer and puffing on his pipe as if hoping the smoke might clear the haze clouding his thoughts. Every thread of the case seemed to unravel before he could grasp it. Nothing quite fit. A young couple had vanished into thin air. A corpse had been stuffed in the trunk for days, and a road accident seemed far from accidental, yet there was no clear connection between these elements. The truck driver swore he had seen no lights on the car before impact, and the cries for help in the darkness raised even more disturbing questions. And now, as if the case weren't tangled enough, a gray-haired man stepped out of a chauffeur-driven car, bracing himself against the relentless assault of flashing cameras, and shouted questions. Maigret barely needed to guess. "Look at this," he murmured to Captain Pilament, his eyes narrowing. "I'll wager that's her father." Monsieur Germain Lepomeray was not a man who invited pity. A notary from Versailles, he carried himself with the effortless authority of one who was used to command. His face, pale and composed, barely betrayed the storm that must have been raging within him. With a simple, dismissive wave of his hand, he silenced the journalists, stepping into the inn as if he had just entered his own courtroom. Inside the small, smoke-filled dining room, Maigret faced him. "Have you found her?" the man asked, his voice controlled but heavy with something deeper fear, perhaps, or resignation. Maigret sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I'm afraid I must ask you some difficult questions, Monsieur Lepomeray." The notary simply waved his hand, as if to say, "Get on with it. I know what's coming." "What made you think your daughter might be involved in this affair?" Maigret asked. The lawyer exhaled sharply, his eyes briefly closing before he began. "You must understand my daughter. Vivienne is only 17, but she looks 20. I say is, although I suppose by now I should say was." He hesitated, the first crack in his composure showing. "She is impulsive, just like her mother was, and since I became a widower, I have always been reluctant to suppress her nature." "And Jean Vertbois, how did she meet him?" "Somewhere in Paris. At a swimming pool, I believe, or perhaps a sports club near the Bois de Boulogne. I didn't pay much attention at first, but then—" He stopped, lips pressing together in distaste. "Then one evening she declared, quite out of nowhere, 'Daddy, I'm going to get married.'" Maigret looked up sharply. "Married?" The lawyer gave a weary nod. "At first I laughed, then I realized she was serious. And so I told her, 'Fine, bring him to see me.'" And so Jean Vertbois had arrived at Versailles one afternoon, presenting himself as a suitor. Monsieur Lepomeray's expression darkened as he recalled that day. I disliked him immediately. His voice was flat, decisive. Not because he was poor. Ambition, when honest, is admirable. But there was something off about him. He drove up to my house in a flashy sports Caron that I later discovered belonged to a friend. Do you see what I mean? A young man who enjoys luxury he cannot afford, who presents himself as something he is not. That I do not trust. The meeting didn't go well then. The notary's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. It was disastrous. I asked him quite simply, "How do you intend to provide for my daughter?" And his answer, he laughed. "I'll manage," he said. "I always do." "And that was enough for you to refuse?" "Of course. My daughter is headstrong, but she is also naive. She was infatuated with the idea of a whirlwind romance, of running away. But love cannot survive on dreams alone, Inspector." I told her she would not see him again. "And did she listen?" The notary's silence was answer enough. Days later, Vivienne had vanished. Gone without a word, without a note except for one cryptic message left on her dressing table. "You'll see, Daddy. I know what I'm doing." That was on Monday. The same day Jean Vertbois had bought his car. The same day the corpse in the trunk had been murdered. Coincidence? Maigret didn't believe in coincidences. If Vivienne Lepomeray had truly been in love, had she run away willingly, or had she been lured? Had Jean Vertbois been a desperate young man trying to escape something bigger than himself, or had he been the architect of something far darker? And the most chilling question of all, if Jean Vertbois and Vivienne were not the ones who died in that car, where were they now? Monsieur Germain Lepomeray spoke with the firm authority of a man who had spent a lifetime weighing words like currency. But beneath that measured exterior, Maigret sensed something de pere father caught between outrage and helplessness. The notary's voice was steady as he recounted his ill-fated meeting with Jean Vertbois, yet his fingers betrayed him, tightening into fists with every recollection. He had asked the young man a simple question: how did he intend to support a wife? Vertbois had replied with a disconcerting frankness that unsettled even a seasoned man like Lepomeray. Appending an improvement in his financial situation, he said, "Vivienne's dowry would at least prevent her from starving." A shameless little opportunist, the notary had thought at the time, disgusted by the audacity. And yet, the more he observed the boy, the more he wondered, was this arrogance a mask for insecurity? Or was he simply so brazen that he didn't care who saw through him? Vertbois had lectured him at length about how parents assume rights over their children, how certain bourgeois men like La Pommeraye himself clung to their reactionary beliefs as though they were divine truths. It had been insufferable. After an hour of enduring the young man's impudence, the notary had thrown him out. "How long ago was this?" Maigret asked, studying the older man's face. "Barely a week," La Pommeraye answered. "When I saw my daughter afterward, she was furious. She declared that she would marry Vertbois, and no one else, accused me of misjudging him, and threatened to run away if I didn't consent to their marriage." Maigret leaned forward, his pipe smoldering between his fingers. "And you held firm?" "Of course. I believed it was an empty threat. I assumed time would bring her to her senses." La Pommeraye exhaled sharply, as if disgusted with his own miscalculation. "And now, since yesterday afternoon, Vivienne has disappeared. I went to Rue des Acacias that evening where Vertbois lived, but the concierge informed me that he had already left on a journey. Not alone either. A very young girl had been seen with him. There was no doubt in my mind it was Vivienne. The weight of it settled between them, thick and suffocating like cigar smoke in a closed room." Then, in a voice that was unnervingly steady, the notary continued, "When I read about the car accident in the midday papers, about the body found in the trunk." He stopped. For the first time since he had entered the inn, the control cracked. There were beads of sweat on his forehead, though his gaze remained averted, refusing to betray too much. When he spoke again, it was not as a man of law but as a father. "Superintendent," he said, voice quiet yet firm, "I beg you frank with me. I can take a direct blow. What I cannot endure is the slow agony of uncertainty. In your opinion, is my daughter still alive?" A long silence stretched between them. Maigret, unlike the journalists buzzing outside, never answered in haste. Finally, instead of a direct response, he asked, "Monsieur La Pommeraye, you seem to know your daughter well. From what you've said, her love for Vertbois was a passionate, youthful kind of devotion. But tell me, do you believe that if she discovered he was a murderer, she would have become his accomplice out of love? Take your time before answering. Picture the moment clearly your daughter arrives at his apartment, breathless from excitement, ready to run away with him. But instead of romantic declarations, she finds something else: crime already committed. Suppose she learned that, in his desperation to escape with her, he had resorted to murder. What would she have done?" La Pommeraye's expression hardened, but his lips remained pressed together. He was not a man given to hasty words. When he finally exhaled, it was not in confidence, but in uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted at last. "However, I will tell you something that no one else knows. I told you I am a widower. That is true. But what I did not tell you is how my wife left me. She abandoned me 8 years ago to live with a coffee planter in South America, and before she went, she took 100,000 francs from the safe in my office. When I say Vivienne is like her mother," he hesitated, "I mean she has that same wild streak, that same defiance, and that same desire to be free." Maigret sighed, nodding slightly. "Then I hope you're right." La Pommeraye's head jerked up, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "Because if Jean Vertbois has nothing to fear from his companion, then he has no reason to get rid of her. But if, when your daughter discovered the body in the trunk, she reacted with horror, if she threatened to expose him." Maigret let the unspoken horror settle between them. La Pommeraye swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. "I understand your reasoning. But what I do not understand is the sequence of events. According to the newspapers, when the collision occurred, the car was not empty. The lorry driver and the bargee both heard cries. Vertbois and Vivienne were still inside. Why then would they have separated?" Maigret stood, tapping the ashes from his pipe. "That, Monsieur La Pommeraye, is exactly what I intend to find out. But I will tell you this, our men have been dragging the river all day, and so far they've found nothing." A flicker of something hope crossed the notary's face, but he did not speak. Maigret gestured for him to follow. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you should see." He led La Pommeraye upstairs to the modest room the couple had occupied. It was unremarkable floral-patterned wallpaper, a brass bedstead, a mahogany wardrobe. On the dressing table, a few personal items remained undisturbed: a razor, a shaving brush, and 2 toothbrushes. One of them, Maigret noted, was new. "You see," he murmured, "the man had his own personal items with him. But the girl," he trailed off, letting the notary draw his own conclusion. Viviane had left in a hurry. She had brought nothing of her own. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had not planned on leaving at all. The room was silent except for the distant sound of rain drumming against the windowpane. The floral wallpaper, the brass bedstead, the travel-worn suitcase in the corner, everything in the modest inn-room seemed ordinary. And yet, Maigret knew that this unremarkable space was the last known trace of Viviane Le Pommeraye. He studied the items scattered about: a razor, a shaving brush, a fresh toothbrush, and a pair of traveling slippers by the bed. The couple must have stopped somewhere on the way to buy these, he murmured, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. A toothbrush for the girl. Slippers to keep her feet warm. It suggests they were preparing for a journey. He turned back to Le Pommeraye, watching the notary's face for any reaction. "But what I need is proof, concrete proof, that your daughter was here, that it was really Viviane." The father didn't hesitate. With a heavy sigh, he walked forward and bent down, plucking something from the floor. When he held it up to the dim light, a small gleaming object caught Maigret's eye. "Here is your proof," Le Pommeraye said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of resignation. "These earrings belong to my wife. When Viviane was a child, she used to play with them, twirling them in her tiny hands. When she grew older, they became her prized possession. She never went anywhere without them." His fingers trembled slightly as he held the earring aloft. One of them always fastened badly. She kept losing it, always finding it again by some small miracle. His voice wavered, but this time she didn't come back for it. "Now tell me, Superintendent, do you still believe I have any hope of finding my daughter alive?" Maigret felt the weight of the question settle in the air between them like a lead weight. He could have given the man false hope, offered him comforting words. But he knew that would be a cruelty greater than the truth. Instead, he turned away slightly, inhaling deeply from his pipe. What he did not say, what he dared not say, was that if Viviane Le Pommeraye was alive, she would likely face a charge of complicity in murder. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the roof in relentless sheets. Downstairs, the Auberge aux Noyers was beginning to resemble an army headquarters. Policemen moved in and out of the building, their boots wet with river mud. Journalists, growing restless, had abandoned their posts at the riverside, where divers had spent the day dragging the Loing in search of bodies. Some had resigned themselves to a game of belote, muttering among themselves as they waited for fresh developments. The captain of the gendarmerie had put a car at Maigret's disposal, but the superintendent had ignored it, preferring to move on foot, to observe without being observed. His seemingly random actions puzzled those who didn't understand his methods. And so, when he stepped into the telephone booth at the far end of the inn, the reporters, sensing a potential lead, immediately surrounded the door. They strained to catch any snippet of conversation, but Maigret's words were both unexpected and baffling. "Paris Observatory," he asked, his voice calm and deliberate. "I need the latest weather forecast. Yes, the details are important. You're certain? No moon last night around 8 p.m. And tonight, it won't rise until 10 past midnight. Good, thank you." When he emerged from the booth, his face was unreadable, but a hint of satisfaction played at the corners of his mouth. The journalists, ever hungry for a scoop, pounced at once. "Well, Superintendent," one of them demanded. Maigret exhaled a cloud of smoke, a mischievous gleam in his eye. "Good news, gentlemen," he said, his voice tinged with dry humor. "We shall have torrential rain for 3 more days." Before they could press him further, he turned away and walked toward Captain Pilament, engaging in a long and hushed conversation. Whatever they discussed, it sent the captain off on an errand from which he did not return for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, inside the inn, a different kind of tension was building. Someone had discovered a bottle of Vouvray, and soon the air was thick with the scent of wine and cigarette smoke. Lily, the innkeeper's niece, moved from table to table, her laughter bright and careless. Roving hands reached for her as she passed, but she did not pull away too sharply. The scene was one of unease masked as revelry, a distraction from the real question that loomed over them all: where was Viviane Le Pommeraye? By 4:30, darkness had fallen, signaling an end to the search in the Lowing. If the bodies had not surfaced by now, there was little hope they would. By this point, the river's current would have carried them downstream, perhaps as far as the Seine. A breakdown truck arrived to retrieve the car that had been fished out of the river earlier that morning. The wreck was taken to Montargis and impounded by the police, a silent and waterlogged witness to whatever had happened the night before. At 6 o'clock, one of the journalists, growing tired of the waiting game, called out to the innkeeper, "What's for dinner tonight?" But before the innkeeper could answer, a voice rang out, "Nothing." A murmur of confusion spread through the room as all eyes turned toward the speaker. It was Maigret. He stepped forward, his expression as calm as ever, yet carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. "I am going to ask you, gentlemen," he continued, "not to dine here tonight." The protest was immediate. "Why not?" someone asked. Maigret raised a hand, his voice steady but firm. "I don't forbid you from returning later, if you wish. After 10 o'clock, you may come back, even stay the night. But between 7 and 9, I want this inn to be occupied only by those who were here last night." A murmur of realization passed through the crowd. "A reconstruction," someone guessed. Maigret's lips curled slightly. "Not even that. But let me warn you, hiding in the neighborhood will do you no good. You won't see anything, however." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "If you cooperate, you might just have an exclusive for tomorrow morning's paper." A hush fell over the journalists. They glanced at each other, weighing the offer. "At what time?" one finally asked. "Let's say before 11. Maigret let the words hang in the air before adding, "I know a place in Montargis where you can get a first-class meal, the Hôtel de la Cloche. Go there, all of you. Tell the proprietor I sent you, and you'll be well looked after." One of the reporters frowned. "And you're not dining with us?" Maigret shook his head. "No," he said simply. "I already have plans." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the rain. The last of the journalists shuffled out of the inn, grumbling as they went, leaving behind only a few lingering traces of cigarette smoke and the scent of wet wool. Maigret exhaled slowly, finally able to breathe freely. The weight of too many curious eyes had lifted, if only for a while. He cast a sideways glance at the innkeeper, who stood behind the bar, arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression stormy. "Come now," Maigret said with a hint of amusement. "You make your real money selling drinks, not serving meals, and those gentlemen have been drinking since morning. You always say you haven't got time to waste," the proprietress teased as she poured their coffee. "But then you spend a quarter of an hour over your cup." "True enough," Lecoin muttered, but his usual bravado had dimmed. The other lorry drivers finished their meals and, after a final round of mark, rose from their seats. One by one they filed out into the night, their engines purring to life and fading into the distance. Maigret checked his watch again. Then, turning to the proprietress, he said, "Mark for us too." He poured a measure of the strong, amber-colored spirit into his glass, swirling it slightly before taking a sip. Then, setting the glass down, he fixed Lecoin with a knowing look. "So," he said quietly, "shall we talk now?" The rain continued to lash against the windshield. Heavier now, drumming against the lorry's metal frame like 1,000 tiny hammers. The road ahead stretched into an endless void of darkness, cut only by the occasional flash of headlights from distant vehicles. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of damp fabric, tobacco, and the lingering warmth of their meal at Mère Catherine's. Maigret leaned back slightly, watching Lecoin out of the corner of his eye. The man was tense now, his usual easy manner replaced by something more guarded. The superintendent let the silence settle between them before he finally spoke. "That's how it was yesterday, wasn't it?" he asked, his tone casual, almost conversational. Lecoin exhaled, keeping his hands steady on the wheel. "Yes, indeed. Just about this time I was heading off. I'd had my phone call. Let's go then. Back there? Lecoin asked, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Do just what you did yesterday. Do you mind? Maigret's gaze was steady, unreadable. No, why should I? Lecoin gave a shrug, trying to sound indifferent. Since I've got nothing to hide. Just then, Catherine, the proprietress's daughter, approached, brushing a few stray curls from her forehead as she looked at Lecoin expectantly. Did you give my message to Benoit? Lecoin nodded. Yes, it's all settled. Once they were back in the lorry, Maigret lit his pipe and exhaled a thin stream of smoke before asking, Who is Benoit? He keeps a petrol pump at Montargis, a pal of mine. I always stop there to fill up. Old Catherine wants to have a pump fixed up at her place, so I told Benoit. Outside, the storm raged on. The rain was coming down in thick sheets, hammering against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. It's raining harder than yesterday, Maigret remarked, his voice calm, almost distant. A real miserable night to be on the road. You can say that again, Lecoin muttered. People think it's easy for us lorry drivers. We always get the blame taking the middle of the road, not pulling over fast enough. But if those small car drivers had to handle beasts like this in weather like this. He didn't get to finish. Suddenly, he let out a sharp curse and slammed on the brakes. The lorry shuddered violently, its tires skidding against the wet pavement before it came to a screeching halt. Maigret was thrown forward, barely catching himself against the dashboard before his head could smash into the windshield. Good Lord. Lecoin's voice was tight, his hand still gripping the wheel as his breath came in short bursts. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There, in the exact spot where Jean Vertboy's car had been struck the night before, was another vehicle. A gray car. Its headlights were off. The rain was falling. The night was dark. The resemblance was eerie. Lecoin turned to Maigret slowly, his face clouded with suspicion. Was it you who put it there? The superintendent didn't answer immediately. He took his time relighting his pipe, letting the flickering match illuminate his face for a brief moment before he tossed it away. Lecoin scowled. You might have warned me, suppose I hadn't seen it in time. And yet, Maigret said mildly, we were talking the whole time. Lecoin frowned. So what? Yesterday, you were alone, Maigret pointed out. No one to distract you, and yet somehow you didn't see the car in time. Lecoin shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath. The tension in the cab was thick, pressing down like the storm outside. What do you want now? He asked gruffly. We're going to get down, Maigret said, opening his door. This way. Wait a minute. I want to try an experiment. Lecoin hesitated, watching Maigret warily. Shout for help, the superintendent instructed. Lecoin blinked. Me? Yes. Since the people who were shouting yesterday aren't here, someone has to take their place. The driver hesitated, his jaw tightening. Something in Maigret's voice, in the deliberate way he was orchestrating the scene, made him uneasy. But there was no way out of it now. Reluctantly, he cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a yell. Help! Someone help! The sound was swallowed by the storm, but it carried far enough. Maigret stood still, waiting, and then footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving hesitantly toward them. Come here, Maigret called out. It was the skipper of the Belle Thérèse, the man Maigret had quietly summoned through the gendarmerie earlier that day. He looked confused, glancing between the two men. Well, Maigret prompted. The skipper rubbed the back of his neck, squinting through the rain. It's not easy to say for sure, but I think it was about the same. What's that supposed to mean? Lecoin demanded, his voice sharp. I don't know who shouted, the skipper admitted. But the sound, it was more or less the same as yesterday. Lecoin's face darkened, his fists clenched at his sides, his entire body coiled as if ready to lash out. For a moment, it seemed like he might strike the man standing before him, unaware of the part he was playing in Maigret's trap. But then, just as quickly, he exhaled sharply and turned away. Maigret didn't flinch. Get back into the lorry, he said calmly. As they climbed back into the vehicle, another figure stepped out of the shadows. Captain Pilament. It's going all right, Maigret murmured to him in a low voice. We shall see what happens next. Inside the lorry, Lecoin's demeanor had changed completely. The false bravado was gone. His movements were stiff, mechanical. What now? He asked, barely concealing his irritation. Do what you did yesterday. Lecoin's fingers flexed over the gear stick. Go to Montargis, just as you did yesterday. He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know what you're thinking, but if you believe I've got anything to do with this affair. They drove in silence. As they passed the inn again, 4 windows were lit, one of them bearing the telephone number in large enamel letters. So, Maigret said suddenly, you never thought of stopping to make a phone call. I've already told you so. Carry on. Silence fell once more. Maigret sat back, smoking his pipe, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Lecoin was tense, every now and then making abrupt, jerky movements. They reached Montargis. Then, suddenly, Maigret spoke again. You've gone past it. What? The gendarmerie. Lecoin gritted his teeth. That's your fault. With all this fuss, I didn't see it. Maigret smiled faintly, watching the man beside him begin to unravel. The noose was tightening, and soon, very soon, there would be no way out. The lorry's tires groaned as Lecoin began to back up toward the gendarmerie station, only 50 meters away. But before he could get far, Maigret cut him off with a firm protest. No, no, carry on. Lecoin stiffened, gripping the wheel. Carry on what? Doing just what you did yesterday. But I went to. You didn't go straight to the gendarmerie, Maigret interrupted, his voice cool but insistent. The proof is that the times don't fit. There was a gap. Where is Benoit's filling station? At the second turning, Lecoin answered cautiously. Let's go there. What for? Nothing. Just do what I tell you. Lecoin muttered under his breath, but obeyed, guiding the heavy lorry toward the second turning. The road was slick with rain. The glow of street lamps distorted into long golden smears on the wet pavement. Finally, they reached Benoit's filling station, a modest, unassuming place in front of a small house with a bicycle shop below. The shop was dark, its windows lifeless, but at the back of the house, a faint glow emanated from the kitchen. Through the dimly lit window, shadowy figures could be seen moving inside. As the lorry ground to a halt with a heavy hiss of the brakes, a man emerged from the kitchen. He wiped his hands on his trousers as he walked toward the vehicle, not even glancing up at first. How many liters? He asked, his voice tired, mechanical. Then, as he got closer, he recognized the lorry and froze. His head snapped up, eyes locking onto Lecoin with barely concealed surprise. What are you doing here? He asked, a flicker of something ease, perhaps passing over his face. I thought. Lecoin cut him off hastily, his voice too quick, too forced. Give me 50 liters. Inside the lorry, Maigret remained still, hidden in the shadows of his corner, unseen by Benoit. He said nothing, only watched. If left undisturbed, Benoit might have spoken freely, revealing something unintentionally. But Lecoin, sensing the danger, reacted swiftly. He turned in his seat and spoke just loudly enough for Benoit to hear. Is that all you want then, Monsieur le Commissaire? Maigret caught the slight tremor in his voice. Lecoin was trying to signal something. Benoit stiffened. Oh? He peered closer. Is someone with you? Someone from the police, Lecoin muttered with an exaggerated sigh. Doing what he calls a reconstruction. I don't understand a thing about it. It's always people like us that get pestered, while. Maigret took this moment to move. He slipped out of the lorry quietly and stepped toward the dimly lit shop. The door was slightly ajar, the kitchen's warmth spilling into the cold night. Inside, a woman, Benoit's wife, was clearing the table. She turned at the sound of movement, eyes narrowing suspiciously at the stranger in her home. Maigret gave her a slight nod. Lecoin wanted to know how things are going, he said casually, testing the waters. She hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the door, her expression wary. Is Lecoin there? She asked. He's filling up. A flicker of concern crossed her face. He's not got into any trouble. The anxiety in her voice didn't escape Maigret's notice. She was worried. But about what? The woman moved toward the door, pushing it open further, squinting into the rain. The light from the kitchen barely reached the edge of the pavement. In the dimness, it was hard to make out faces. "Say, Paul," she called to her husband, who was still struggling with the petrol hose. "Is Lecoin there?" Maigret took advantage of the moment. He stepped further inside, reaching into his pocket. With deliberate slowness, he filled his pipe and struck a match, letting the brief flare of flame illuminate the room. The light glinted off the nickel handlebars of a row of bicycles lined up against the wall. Outside, the conversation between Benoit and Lecoin continued, the tension thickening. Then Maigret heard it. A low, hurried whisper. "What'll we do?" The words were faint, spoken quickly, but he caught them. He didn't move, didn't react outwardly, but inside he was alert. With practiced ease, he reached into his coat and wrapped his fingers around his revolver. He didn't draw it. Not yet, but he kept it ready, his thumb resting on the hammer, prepared to fire through his coat if necessary. Outside, the street was deserted, the rain turning the pavement into a slick, gleaming surface. The light from the filling station cast long shadows that flickered as the wind tossed the branches of a nearby tree. Lecoin was a big man, strong. He could take down an opponent with a single blow. And now, he was stepping down from the lorry, his movements heavy, deliberate. The woman stood in the doorway, watching with a tense expression, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Lecoin took a few steps along the pavement, then hesitated. Maigret made his move. "Suppose we go and discuss things inside," he said, his voice calm, steady. Benoit froze for half a second. Then, with a sharp nod, he hurriedly hung up the petrol hose. Lecoin exhaled sharply, screwing the stopper back onto the fuel tank. His hesitation was brief. Finally, with a rough shrug, he muttered, "After all, this wasn't part of the arrangement." He turned to Maigret, his tone half mocking, half resigned. "After you, Superintendent." Inside, the small home was exactly what Maigret expected a working-class household, unremarkable in every way. A carved oak sideboard, a checkered oilcloth covering the table, pink and mauve fairground trophies lined up as vases, the kind of decor that spoke of modest aspirations and simple tastes. "Sit down," the woman muttered, wiping the table with the edge of her apron. Benoit moved to the sideboard, retrieving a bottle and pouring 4 small glasses in silence. He set them down with a dull clink. Lecoin slumped onto a chair, swinging his legs over the back and leaning his elbows against it. He stared at Maigret, his expression hardening. "Did you suspect something?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharper now, his gaze locked onto the superintendent's. Maigret didn't answer right away. He lifted his glass, swirling the liquid before taking a slow sip. Then he set it down. "For 2 reasons," he said finally. "First, because the only shouts heard last night were—" And then he stopped, because in that moment, Maigret saw something flicker across Lecoin's face. Not just annoyance, not just defiance. Fear. And that told him everything he needed to know. Maigret leaned forward, his steady gaze locked onto Lecoin, his voice measured but sharp. "The only shouts heard that night," he said, "were in a man's voice." Lecoin didn't flinch, but Maigret saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Which is rather strange," Maigret continued, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "Considering that a girl was present. If she were drowning, wouldn't she have screamed? She was a good enough swimmer to stay on the surface long enough to call for help." Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. The woman in the room shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Benoit, standing by the sideboard, kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Maigret didn't let up. "Then there's the other problem," he went on. "After an accident like that, why would someone drive 20 kilometers to the police when there was a telephone nearby? The inn's windows were lit up. It would have been impossible not to think of asking for help there first." Lecoin exhaled sharply, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "Sure," he muttered. "It was him who insisted. He got into the lorry, obviously. Maigret asked, watching closely. Lecoin hesitated, but it was too late to turn back now. The story was unraveling, and the two men knew it. Meanwhile, the woman's face had changed. She no longer looked afraid. Instead, there was something almost like relief in her expression. "It's not worth it," she muttered under her breath. "Not for 2 wretched 1,000-franc notes." Her husband nodded, then turned to Lecoin. "Better tell him." Lecoin sighed, reached for his glass, and drained it in one long gulp. Then he set it down with a clatter and looked up at Maigret, his voice rough. "Let's say it happened just like tonight," he admitted. "You were right. In spite of the rain, in spite of my bad wiper, I've got good enough eyes and good enough brakes not to run into a stationary car. So I stopped, about 1.5 meters away." His voice took on a distant tone as he recalled the moment. "I thought someone must have had a breakdown. So I got out, ready to lend a hand. That's when I saw him." "The young man?" Maigret asked. Lecoin nodded. He was nervous, agitated, like he'd been waiting for something to happen. Then he turned to me and asked if I wanted to earn 2,000 francs. Maigret's lips curled in a wry smile. "By helping him push the car into the water." Lecoin shrugged. "At a pinch, he could have done it himself. That's what he was trying to do when I turned up. But what he really wanted was to disappear, to be taken far away, somewhere no one would find him." Maigret leaned in. "And you agreed?" Lecoin exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand across his face. "I might not have. If he'd been alone, I'd have driven away. But there was the girl. She was still alive." Lecoin looked Maigret straight in the eyes. "Yes." A strange hush settled over the room. "To persuade me," Lecoin went on, "he told me that people were trying to stop them from getting married, that they were in love, that they wanted to fake a suicide so that no one would come looking for them. I don't like that kind of game, but if you'd seen her, the kid standing in the rain, drenched, shivering." His voice trailed off. "So after all, I helped them," he admitted. "Helped them shove the car into the lowing. The young couple hid in my lorry, and they asked me to call for help, to make it seem real, to make it look like they'd both drowned. So I shouted, and then I drove them to Montargis." Maigret's mind was racing. "And then?" Lecoin gave a half-smile, one of bitter admiration. The young man wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't stop at a hotel, knew he couldn't take a train. He asked me if I knew someone who, for another 2,000 francs, would hide them until the inquiry blew over. And I thought of Benoit. All eyes turned to the mechanic and his wife. "We believed them," the woman said defensively. "We believed they were just 2 runaway lovers." She gestured toward the back of the house. "We had an empty room, her brother, in-laws, who's away with the army." Maigret's stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. "Are they still in the house?" he asked sharply. She hesitated. Then quietly she said, "She isn't." Maigret's head snapped toward her. "What?" Benoit spoke up, his voice slow and hesitant. "This afternoon I saw the newspaper. I went upstairs, asked if the story about the body was true. The girl, she grabbed the paper from my hands, read it, and then, before I could stop her, she bolted, ran straight out." Maigret stood up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "Without her coat. Without a coat. Without a hat." "And the young man?" "He swore he didn't understand. Said he'd only just bought the car. Said he never even thought of opening the luggage compartment." Maigret turned toward the door, his instincts screaming at him. "Is there another way out of this house?" Benoit shook his head. "No, just." Crash. A violent noise shattered the tense silence. Maigret spun around and rushed outside. The cold air hit his face as he stepped onto the pavement, his eyes scanning the street. A figure lay sprawled on the ground, groaning in pain. A young man, his breath coming in ragged gasps, struggling to get up. His leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. He had jumped from the upstairs window. But even with a broken leg, he still tried to run. Maigret didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, his hand going to his revolver as he took a step forward. "If you come any closer, I'll shoot," the young man screamed. His voice was raw, desperate. But he didn't fire. Whether from fear or a failure of nerve, The gun stayed in his trembling hand. Maigret lunged. The young man barely had time to react before Maigret tackled him, pinning him to the wet pavement. The gun clattered from his grip, skidding across the street. "Quiet now," Maigret murmured, his voice calm but firm. But the young man wasn't finished. Even as he gasped for breath, he thrashed beneath Maigret's hold, his fury boiling over. "They betrayed me," he spat. "The lorry driver, the garage mechanic, his wife, they sold me out." His eyes were wild, his face contorted with rage. He was the typical young delinquent, the kind Maigret had seen 100 times before, the kind who thought they could outsmart the law. And yet here he was. Beaten. Broken. Caught. Jean Vertbois lay sprawled on the ground, his face twisted with pain and fury. His leg was broken, but that didn't stop him from glaring up at Maigret with a hatred that burned like fire. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his fingers twitched, as if still longing for the revolver that had been knocked from his grip. But it was over. Maigret knelt beside him, snapped open the handcuffs, and clicked them around Vertbois' wrists with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. There was no struggle left in him now, just resentment, seething and ugly, festering beneath his skin. "Where is Vivienne?" Maigret's voice was firm, leaving no room for lies. Vertbois hesitated, his lips curling into something that might have been a sneer if it weren't for the sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't know," he muttered. Maigret tightened his grip on the handcuffs, making the metal bite into the man's skin. "So you managed to convince her," he said slowly, "that you pushed the car into the river just to fake a suicide pact?" Vertbois let out a bitter laugh. "She stuck to me like a leech. And that's a problem, isn't it?" Maigret's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it. "When you've got a corpse you can't get rid of." Vertbois flinched. The words had hit home. It was, Maigret thought, one of the foulest crimes he had ever investigated. Stupid, cruel, and revolting. And the kind that never paid in the end. Jean Vertbois had been after money, that much was clear. He had been counting on his marriage to Vivienne Le Pommeraye to secure himself a place in wealth and society. But when that plan had fallen apart, when it became clear that the Le Pommeraye fortune would never be his, no matter what he did, he had turned to a different kind of scheme. A darker one. There had been another woman. A middle-aged woman. She had been his mistress for years, a former light opera singer named Martha Dorval. She had money put aside enough to tempt a man like Vertbois, who had never been able to resist the lure of easy wealth. He had lured her to his apartment. He had murdered her. And then he had taken her money. With part of it, he had bought a cheap Karen afterthought, a means to an end. The body needed to be disposed of, and a car would do the job well enough. He had planned to drive somewhere remote, somewhere where no one would see him, and get rid of the evidence. But then Vivienne. She had shown up unexpectedly, full of passion, full of blind love. She had run away from home, determined to be with him, to throw herself completely into his arms. She was young, naive, and infatuated, and she would not leave his side for a moment. The irony was sickening. For her, the hours they spent driving had been thrilling an escape, an adventure, the beginning of a romantic life together. For Vertbois, it had been a nightmare. Every moment, the corpse was with them. Every second, the dead weight in the back of the car was a reminder of what he had done. While Vivienne had been dreaming of their future, whispering to him, holding his hand, he had been thinking of only one thing: how to get rid of the body. He had panicked. He had seen no way out. And so he had come up with the idea of the fake suicide. If they staged a double drowning, he could make it seem like they had both died together. The car would sink. The corpse inside would be unrecognizable, and he would disappear into the night with Vivienne, none the wiser. It might have worked. But then fate had intervened, a lorry driver on the road at the wrong time, stopping to help. The plan had spiraled out of control. Now, sitting in the dimly lit room at the Nemours police station, Maigret exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. The case was nearly closed. Nearly. The reporters, who had been drinking and feasting at La Cloche, were waiting for their news. When Maigret finally stepped into the room, They fell silent, eager. "The murderer of Martha Dorval," he said, "is in the hospital." A murmur spread through the room. Someone called out, "Martha Dorval." Maigret nodded. A former light opera singer. She had money saved up. She was also Jean Vertbois' mistress. A flash of excitement passed between the journalists. "He's in the hospital," another voice asked. "At Montargis, with a broken leg." Maigret gave a tired smile. "Go ahead. Take your pictures. Ask him all the questions you like." One of the reporters hesitated. "And the girl?" Maigret's smile faded. He glanced down. "That," he admitted, "I don't know." And that was the truth. Vivienne had vanished. It was after midnight when the telephone rang in Captain Pillament's home. Maigret, sitting across from him, straightened as the captain answered. Pillament's face changed, first surprise, then satisfaction. "You're certain of the address?" he asked sharply. "Good. Bring me the taxi driver, even if he's drunk." He hung up and turned to Maigret, his eyes alight. "My men found a taxi driver in Montargis. Earlier today he picked up a girl with no hat, no coat. She had him drive her into the countryside near Bourges, to a lonely manor house." Maigret's pulse quickened. "And?" Pillament leaned back in his chair. On the way, the driver started to worry. The girl wasn't carrying a handbag. He thought she might not be able to pay, but she kept repeating, "My aunt will pay." And Maigret understood. Vivienne La Pommeraye, lost and exhausted, had done the only thing she could think of. She had gone to the one place where she had always felt safe. The home of her aunt. The place where, ever since childhood, she had spent her holidays. And so, at last, the chase was over.